Well, we started out this series on emotional intelligence for children and adolescents, and we're also going to mention it for adults. If you look at your program, we've been sticking to the titles of the program. We went through these 5 components because they're the same for both children and adults. One of the components of emotional intelligence is knowing our emotions, being aware of our emotions, managing our emotions, which are critically important in order for us to have comprehensive self-control, recognizing emotions in others, which is important for us to have empathy, which is a part of emotional intelligence, managing relationships with others, which is part of our social intelligence, and then finally motivating ourselves to achieve our goals. Those are the 5 components of emotional intelligence. And the major influence on emotional intelligence is our beliefs, our evaluation of events, the way we think about problems, and our silent self-talk. These are the moment-by-moment messages we give ourselves. So there's a type of therapy, it's now considered to be the gold standard of psychotherapy, which is different than most forms of psychotherapy, called cognitive behavioral therapy. That's what CBT stands for. Traditional psychotherapy just teaches you that your emotional consequence, that C, is related just to the A. The events in your life have produced your emotional consequences. And of course, those from Freud to Erickson to Jung, etc., all these traditional psychotherapy ones are into that A to C aspect. And then Beck and Ellis came along and says, no, this isn't true because we've seen people with identical A's that have very different C's. And so what's going on there? So crooked thinking, which is A to C thinking, this is a quote by Dr. Ellis, believing that we have little or no ability to influence our feelings and that events and situations directly cause our emotions and behavior is indeed crooked. And there's a text that's used repeatedly in Scripture, or I should say a word that's used repeatedly. It's called iniquity. Iniquity means bent or crooked. If I regard iniquity in my heart, the Lord will not hear me. So it's not because the Lord doesn't want to hear us, but the Bible also tells us that God is limited. Most preachers don't speak about the limitation of God, but both the Old and New Testament state that God cannot do certain things, particularly one thing. What is it that God cannot do, for those of you familiar with what the Old and New Testament say? God cannot tell a lie. Now, he's a free moral agent. I suppose he could if he wanted to, but he will always put truth above himself. He's not going to be where deceptions are at. And so if we want to be influenced by God, we need to be willing to straighten out our crooked thoughts and to think truthful thoughts. And then he's very willing to help us along that line. So we have the activating event, then we have the belief, that's the B of the ABCs of emotional intelligence. And then we have the C, the emotional consequence. We can't do, and none of your therapists can do anything about your past A's. But they can do something about your present B's if they're a good cognitive behavioral therapist and help you to get rid of distorted thinking that is going to actually cause greater emotional consequence. Your feelings result simply from the messages you give yourself. Your thoughts have much more to do with how you are feeling than what is actually happening in your life. So that's how critically important our thoughts are, because they have so much more to do with how we are feeling than what is actually happening in our life. So I'm going to go into 3 classic stories, well documented in history and also in the literature of the Bible. And the Bible tells us of a man who was tall, Not just handsome, but stunningly handsome. In fact, when he walked by, people just couldn't quit gazing at him. He was also wealthy, and on top of it, he was well-liked by the general public. Now, I know some single women here today are thinking if I could just find a man with 2 or 3 of those, I might be happy. But this guy had all 4. And he was actually chosen to be the first king over Israel. Now, God, if you go back in history, God did not want them to choose to have a monarch. He did not like the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch all to be in one person. And that's what we call a monarchy. But the other nations had all this, and Israel was being influenced by them, and so they said, no, we want to have a king. And so God chose the best person for the job. He was not only a great man, he was also a humble man. By the way, if there was an election on running for king, Saul would have never ran for it because he was too humble to do that. By the way, that's kind of the problems. You know, in America, I know a lot of you, I've heard about how many of you keep track of American politics. But there's some things that you may not know about American politics. And our Constitution did not want people to run for office, nor did they want the general public to vote for the president. So if you read the Constitution, it's called the Electoral College. You might have heard about that, but many people don't know what that is. The first president selected to be president of the United States never ran for office, and he did not want the job. But the Electoral College voted him in, and he said, please, no, I don't want to do this. And they said, we're a vulnerable country, we're just getting started. You're the best person for the job. I know it would be self-sacrificing for you to do it, but please, will you be president? And he says, I'll do it, and I'm familiar with the Constitution. You can only be president for 4 years, and you have to get reelected and all of that. But just so you know, I'm not going to do it for more than 2 terms, so you better find someone else good enough to do this afterwards. And he didn't actually select his successor at all. And that was the first time in history that the executive leader did not choose his successor at all. And when 8 years came, he walked out one door, and the new person came in and took office from another door that wasn't even George Washington's selection, but it didn't really matter to him because he had mentioned that he wasn't going to be there for 8 years. One of the reasons why I mention that is when you are running for election, you are pretty much stating to the world that you think you have all the qualities necessary to run the country. And so what are you going to select out when you have that type of selection process? You're going to select out people that are very proud and arrogant. And pride and arrogancy is not necessarily a best trait to be a leader. And so one of the reasons why Saul was a good leader, at least at first, is he was a humble man. When he was selected to be coronated now, he was selected to be king, then he was going to be coronated, he was hiding in the baggage. He didn't even want to come out and do that at all. And that's how humble he was. And he was a great king for a couple of years. But I don't know if you've heard the phrase, power corrupts. Have you heard that? What does absolute power do? Corrupts absolutely. And this humble man became a proud man. You know, when everyone comes to you to find out what to do next, you start getting an idea that you might be pretty important. And Saul began to suffer from emotional issues. Research has documented that negative thoughts which cause emotional turmoil nearly always contain what? Gross distortions. The thoughts on the surface appear valid, but you will learn that they are irrational or just plain wrong, and that twisted thinking is a major cause of suffering. So Saul, who didn't have mental illness to begin with, began to suffer from it, and it's clear that he had a cognitive distortion called magnification/minimization. What does that mean? He majored in minors and minored in majors. And when confronted with his own appropriate guilt, Samuel the prophet came to him and said, yeah, we won this battle, but there's a lot of things you didn't do right here. And Saul says, why don't you talk about the things I did do right? We won. And he began to minimize his issues. And by the way, every human being is going to have some issues. There's no one that's absolutely perfect. Sometimes we think our leaders should be, but they are just human beings. But one of their elements of pride that shows that they have too much pride is when they never admit that they make a mistake. And that's where Saul ended up being. And Confucius says a man who has committed a mistake and doesn't correct it is doing what? Committing another mistake. And that another mistake is worse than the first, because you're not going to learn from your mistakes. You are doomed to repeat them. David Schwartz says, we can turn setbacks into victories. How do we do that? Find the lesson, apply it, and move on, then look back on defeat and smile. And another author says, if you have made mistakes, you certainly gain a victory if you see these mistakes and regard them as what? Beacons of warning. Set up your mistakes as beacons of warning, and you will learn from them. You'll thus turn defeat into victory. That's pretty good. Disappointing the enemy. So, when confronted with his own guilt, he justified himself, minimized it, went into either defensiveness or denial, and then he began to magnify. Notice this, he began to magnify himself. This high self-esteem that was now found, that was wounded by the people's and especially the women's obvious preference for another leader. There was another battle. This battle was even more serious, and back in those days it was like ISIS, you know. If you didn't win the battle, your houses were totally taken over, your land was taken over, your wives and daughters were taken over as slaves. Terrible stuff happened. And so those women were very keen on knowing what was going on in that battle, and they found out before the army came back that Israel had won, and they found out particularly why. The all-star of the battle was not Saul in that particular battle. Who was the all-star? Does anyone remember? It was David. And David is coming back in, actually next to Saul, and the ladies were so thrilled they had composed a song for the entry, and that song went like this: Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. Now, I must admit, had I been the choir leader that day and Saul's doctor, I would have encouraged them to change the lyrics. But you remember, those ladies knew Saul to be a humble man. That was what the word was. Very humble, which he was. And so they thought he was just going to put his arm around David and say, aren't we glad that God put him in a position to succeed? And aren't we glad to have David here with us as part of this great army? But instead, his pride was wounded. And he began to go to some dark places. In fact, the first time they sang it, he wasn't sure he heard it right, but then they went back to the chorus again. And then he knew that he had heard it right, And that's when not only did his countenance fall, and he began to have depression, but he also started to develop envy towards someone who wasn't even king. Is it possible for someone in leadership to become envious of someone who's not in the same leadership position? It's very possible, as they see that that might be a possibility for them to become leader. And magnification of self was not unique to Saul. Is not this great Babylon which I have built? Who stated that? Nebuchadnezzar. Did he have emotional problems, Nebuchadnezzar? Severe emotional problems, anxiety, couldn't sleep, panic, all sorts of issues. I will exalt myself above the Most High. That's how this whole problem started. Lucifer, in regards to pride and jealousy. By the way, in regards to Nebuchadnezzar, his problem was so severe, he had to go through a depression and anxiety recovery program. Does anyone know how long his program was? It wasn't an eight-week program like you guys are going to have here. It was a 7-year program. And the first thing God did was put him on a plant-based vegetarian diet. He also put him on an exercise plan. And he also gave him hydrotherapy. And in fact, his problem was so severe, he could just eat the raw greens. Just the raw greens for you, Nebuchadnezzar. And then even music therapy was part of his program. And then finally, cognitive behavioral therapy to get rid of his distorted thoughts about himself. Did the program work? It worked wonderfully well. And that's when he became probably the greatest king ever, because now he was humble, and he had emotional intelligence and general intelligence, and what a king he became. There's in fact, someone was telling me just in the break, there's a little book that we have you read when you go through the 8-week program. It's called Telling Yourself the Truth. And he was saying, I think every person in the world should read that book and apply it. He talked about how much it had changed his own life. We need to learn to tell ourselves the truth. But there's another book written by the same author. By the way, I can promote another one of his books before I get to this one. After you'd learn to tell yourself the truth, I would encourage you to get his next book called Telling Each Other the Truth. It's one of the best books on your social life that you might imagine. And of course, you can't tell each other the truth till you know how to tell yourself the truth. So that's why you want to go through that first one first. But then he also wrote another book. And this is, by the way, William Backus is a cognitive behavioral therapist. He was also a Lutheran minister. But he also wrote a book called What Your Counselor Never Told You. And the subtitle of the book is The 7 Sins That Lead to Mental Illness. And the first sin that leads to mental illness that he talks about is the sin of, it's up there on the screen, the sin of pride. That's what Saul developed. It's what Nebuchadnezzar had, Lucifer, many others. If you're wanting to know why your politicians don't have emotional intelligence, that's probably one of the major reasons. But then he gives you a test to see whether you might have it. Sometimes we can recognize this sin in others, and we miss it in ourselves. Trying to be noticed, craving attention, itching for compliments, needing to be important, detesting the idea of being submissive, loathing the idea of admitting to wrongdoing, strongly opinionated, being argumentative, demanding your way, wanting control over others, flaunting your individual rights, refusing advice, being critical yet resenting criticism, being oversensitive, and finally thinking you have excellences you actually don't even have. William Backus says, watch out. If you have one or more than one of those, what's there? Pride is there, and wounded pride is sure to follow, and emotional issues will come up. In contrast, we're told that Christ was never elated by applause. Maybe of all people, he should have been allowed to have a sense of arrogancy and pride because the Bible says he created the world. But he not only said the words, he lived the words, "Blessed are the meek." Christ was never elated by applause, nor was he dejected by censure or disappointment. By the way, if you're never elated by applause, you won't be dejected by censure or disappointment. It's the sense of arrogancy and pride that leads you to be dejected by those things. Amid the greatest opposition and the most cruel treatment, which he certainly had, he was still of what? Good courage, and even looking for souls to save during his painful crucifixion. Thomas Jefferson says, nothing gives one person so much advantage over another as to remain cool and unruffled under what? All circumstances. You can't do that if you're magnifying things out of proportion. And one of the things that people do when they lose their temper and their anger is excessive is that they are telling themselves, normally it's a lie that they're telling themselves, and that lie is that they can't stand it. I just cannot stand this. And so we have a little song that we teach our participants. You might learn this song if you come through the program, but it's a song called "I Don't Like It." And it goes like this: I don't like it, I don't like it, it's okay, I can stand it anyway, I can stand it anyway, I'm all right, I'm all right. And that song teaches you just because you don't like something doesn't mean you can't stand it. And even some things you don't like can actually be healthy for you. That's why we teach that song even in our residential program before they go through their first hydrotherapy treatment. Their hydrotherapy treatment is actually going to help their circulation in their brain tremendously. We've had many people think that they're not going to be able to stand the hydrotherapy, particularly because they're alternating between hot and cold. And although they don't like that first treatment, afterwards they really like it because it's making them feel better than they've felt in a long time. And by the time 10 days are up, they're actually trying to pay extra for the hydrotherapist to give them more hydrotherapy. And it's because they also learn to be able to recognize that there's only one thing a human being cannot stand, and that is death or things that lead to death. But everything else they actually can stand. But when they tell themselves they can't stand it, that's when emotions start getting out of control. And that's when you're not going to be remaining cool and unruffled under all circumstances. So watch out for I can't stand it-itis. So when Saul underwent the recommended therapy for depression, he would feel better again. Does anyone know what his recommended therapy was? That's right, music therapy. And harp music has still been shown to be beneficial today. The harp is particularly beneficial because you can't play it too loud. The music is too loud. It's not all that healthy for the frontal lobe. And it's the softer melodies and harmonies that work together to help bring some order and organization to the brain. And Saul would actually feel better, and he would also start thinking better after that harp music. But with the three causes still active, and the third cause, wounded pride, becoming even more prominent, he would slip back into anxiety and depression. And finally, he, under a tremendous stress of a battle of battles, and he began to demand that God answer him the way he stated he should answer him. By the way, beware of asking God to answer you the way you state he should answer you. If he doesn't answer you, it may be because he's already answered you, and you're not following his plan. You're going by your own rules instead of his rules, etc. And so when Saul didn't get what he was wanting in regards to an answer, he then went to the wrong counselor, which he even told to beware of those counselors, the category of counselors. And he went to the counselor that told him 95% truth. And that's why he ended up trusting him, because 95% of it was true, and then 5% of it was fatal. He told him, Saul, you have messed up, and you have messed up big. That was true. But then he also said, you have gone beyond any hope for you at all. Feelings of hopelessness is the best correlate of suicidal action. And now that he knew that it was completely hopeless, under tremendous stress the next day, he took his own life, and he also caused another suicide that happened right after him because his armor bearer did the same thing. An unnecessary death had he dealt with the underlying cognitive distortions and practice them. By the way, he would deal with them. I should mention one other aspect of Saul's story. Saul tried to kill his own therapist. I don't know if you're aware of that. And by the way, I should tell you, in our program, we rotate some spiritual counselors, but there's a spiritual counselor. His name is Wyatt Allen. He's written the book. It's a great book, by the way, called The Least of the Least. But Wyatt Allen was put in prison for a long time for trying to kill his own therapist at the age of 15. Significant anger issues. And he was angry at everybody, and his mother, who didn't even believe in God, sent him a Bible. And he had decided he was going to be on the part of the prison where there was no TV, because he thought, I need to get educated. I'm only 15. So I need to try to, eventually when I get out of here, I want to have a high school degree, et cetera. So he didn't want to be distracted by TV. So he began to read the Bible, and he was reading it to try to criticize it because he thought it was a book of fables. But then when he got to Saul's story and saw Saul trying to kill his own therapist, he thought, what's going to happen to this guy? That's exactly what I did. And then he started realizing, hey, the heroes of the Bible, they tell everything about him. This book has to be true. It's not like a biography of a president, of someone who's a political campaign artist who only tells you the good things about that person. The Bible tells it all, even in regards to Abraham and all the heroes. And so he realized intuitively it had to be true, and then he saw the Bible as a mental health book, and by utilizing that Bible, his brain became balanced, and his anger went away. A lot of positive things happened, and so since he's had just about every emotion known to mankind, he's very good at pointing out scriptural themes for people in regards to certain situations that really help to balance their mind. And so he's actually been a good member of our team when he comes. And no one has to be afraid of him anymore. He's actually married, has several children, and has done a lot of good in this world post-prison. But back to Saul. David, who was attempted to be killed by him and was his therapist, David, when Saul was searching for his life in malice to get rid of him, David went over in the middle of the night and cut off part of Saul's clothing to prove that he was there. I think took his water, and then went a mountain away to do some therapy on Saul. You had to do therapy a mountain away. And he wakes up Saul and then says to Saul, what have I done? How is it that you're chasing me around here and trying to kill me? What have I done to actually harm you or harm the nation or anything? And Saul realized he was right. With that therapy, he says, David, you are right. You are completely right. I'm not going to chase you down anymore. just go ahead and go home. You're going to be safe. Did David go ahead and go home after that? No. Why? Because he knew Saul would correct his cognitive distortion short term, but he wouldn't practice it. He wouldn't do it. And this is the thing about cognitive behavioral therapy. You not only need to correct your distorted thoughts once, but we have people write it out on 3x5 cards, their corrected thought. And they need to review that sometimes a couple of times a day to get new pathways in their brain and to get the accurate ways of thinking about things and what a difference it can make. Story number 2. This is a different distortion called emotional reasoning. Emotional reasoning is the belief that your feelings don't lie. If you feel angry and upset at someone else, that proves that someone else has been, in your mind, it proves that someone else has been cruel and insensitive to you. Just because your feelings of anger are there, does that mean that other person has been cruel and insensitive to you? No, it doesn't mean that. There could be a lot of different misinterpretations and the whole bit. And also, if you feel overwhelmed and helpless, does that mean your problems are impossible to solve? No, just because you feel overwhelmed and helpless doesn't mean your problems are impossible to solve at all. Although we do have people come to our program that believe that. They're sent there by a relative because that relative loves them enough to try to get them better, but they're thinking, this program isn't going to help me at all. And they'll even say that as they come in. Nor this program or any other program, it's impossible for me to get any better. I am actually hopeless in my mental health condition. And so I'll ask them the question, do you think the biggest expert in the world on depression or anxiety might not know something about it? They'll think about it and say, yeah, probably even the biggest expert doesn't know something about depression and anxiety. And then I'll ask them, if the biggest expert doesn't know something about depression and anxiety, could it be possible that you don't know something about depression and anxiety that could actually help you? And then they'll think and say, well, maybe. And so if I can just get a maybe out of them and they start to participate in these things that'll help them, they will get indeed a lot of help. So one of the persons that had emotional reasoning, you can be a smart person and have emotional reasoning. It was Solomon. I said in mine heart, go to now, I'll prove thee with mirth, therefore enjoy pleasure. And he talked about how he would use alcohol, he would use drugs of the day, because people that used it looked like it was making them happy, and he wanted to be happy as well. And then he went into this, whatsoever mine eyes desired, I kept not from them. I withheld not my heart from any joy. What was he not keeping his eyes from? It was women. 1 wife was not enough. 10 wives were not enough. 300 wives were not enough. 700 concubines were not enough. Where did that lead him? Therefore, I what? Hated life, for all is vanity and vexation of spirit. Therefore, I went about to cause my heart to despair. One of the authors of the biography of Solomon said, many envied the popularity and abundant glory of Solomon, thinking that of all men he must be the most happy. In fact, Forbes magazine had an article about him a few years ago saying that he was far wealthier than any of the wealthy men today in regards to how much money he had compared to the global monetary supply. That's how you rate wealth. But amid all that glory of artificial display, the man envied is the one to be most pitied. His countenance is dark with despair. All the splendor about him is but a mockery of the distress and anguish of his thoughts as he reviews his misspent life and seeking for happiness. How? Through indulgence and what else? Selfish gratification of every desire. By his own bitter experience, Solomon learned the emptiness of a life that seeks in earthly things its highest good. Gloomy and soul-harassing thoughts troubled him night and day. For him there was no longer any joy of life. If you don't have any joy of life, by definition, you have depression. Nor did he have any peace of mind. If you don't have any peace of mind, by definition, you have anxiety. And the future was dark with despair. Fortunately, Solomon recognized how bad off he was emotionally. He did have the help of a prophet. Prophet came to him and told him the kingdom was going to be taken away from him. And that woke him up as well. And then he reversed himself and ended up writing the book Ecclesiastes to warn every young person not to go the route that he did. By the way, there's more fun things to do than ever before in human history, but yet we have more depression and anxiety than ever before. And a lot of that is due to these fun things suppressing the frontal lobe of the brain. And that's what was happening to Solomon. False ways of altering the way he would feel. By the way, you can never get enough of what you don't need. Why is that? Because what you don't need will never satisfy you. And you know, we talked a little bit about intimacy and emotional health. We've had many individuals come to our program. I remember one girl who had come 19 years old, couple of suicide attempts, always in the face of broken relationships. And she had unfortunately been abused at age 13 and 14 and 15 and had developed this thought that she needed to be in a relationship and she needed to be in a sexual relationship. How can you tell the difference between needs and wants? You ask yourself this question: how long can I go without this before I die? How long can I go without this before I die? If it doesn't affect that, it is not a need. And I had to tell her, I look at every death certificate. I teach principles of health at Weimar University, so I'm always giving you the latest statistics on deaths. And in America, you have to sign what caused the death, and then what caused that, and then what caused that. And you go down 4 different layers. No one in the United States has ever signed a death certificate, lack of sex as a cause of death. What does that mean? It's a want, but it is not a need. But Solomon got it to the point where it was a need, and it was a need in regards to not just his marriage partners and those sorts of things, and it led him down that path. And you know, people will get, whatever their addiction is, people will get this idea that it's harmful for most people, but for me, I need it. Because without it, I'm not going to be able to survive. And that act, they are telling themselves a significant lie. You can never get enough of what you what? Don't need. Because what you don't need will never satisfy you. There have been studies done on pornography. University of Indiana, University of Wisconsin did a randomized controlled trial a couple of decades ago. Some people probably have accurately stated you couldn't do this trial today because, you know, before the internet, there were many people that had never been exposed to it. But when they did randomize people to get exposed to it, 150 college men and women, after 6 weeks, less interested and less attracted to their partner if they had one, more self-absorbed, anxiety went up, less empathy for others around them, diminished ability to foresee consequences, that means the frontal lobe was going down, and they began to live in a very self-centered world and shut down emotionally in just what period of time? 6 weeks. The author of the study said the negative effects of pornography on emotional intelligence have been more consistently proven now than the links between smoking and lung cancer. By the way, that link is pretty strong, smoking and lung cancer, but there's something more strong. And by the way, I wish our world governments would do more about this. The harm is very clear. Even in America, the state of Texas passed a law where before you view pornography on the internet, you would have to see all of the adverse effects of it. It's going to cause more anger. It's going to cause this. It's going to cause less compassion for your partner if you have one. It's going to cause all the things that has been shown. and then say, do you still want to look at it? And unfortunately, the appeals court said that was unconstitutional to pass a law where they have to look at the consequences before they do it. I don't know why it is, because in cigarette packages, you have the complications there. But there are powerful people making a lot of money in this arena that are very connected with government, and society is declining significantly as a result. It's now well established that one of the main characteristics of virtually all depressed individuals, no matter what the underlying cause is, a significant decrease in the frontal lobe's blood flow and activity. By the way, we did a study on SPECT scans. This is a person coming to our program that's depressed, and then in 9 days later, we did another SPECT scan and noticed the marked improvement in the frontal lobe of the brain. And this is going to be associated with complete recovery and eradication of depression and anxiety. Fortunately, brains can change for the better. The Bible says no one should say God tempts, because God doesn't tempt anyone. Each one is tempted when he is dragged away and enticed by his own evil feelings. But the problem is, feelings can lie. And that's why when we have feelings, we need to elevate them to our frontal lobe. So what is the solution? Jonathan Martinson says, feelings are much like waves. We can't stop them from coming, but we can choose which one to surf. And we choose the one that's based on what is real and helpful. Thomas Jefferson also said something very profound here. Thomas Jefferson, by the way, was the writer of the Declaration of Independence in America, and he was also the founder of the Democratic Party. Democratic Party isn't anything like it was when Thomas Jefferson founded it, but nonetheless, he said this: don't bite at the bait of pleasure until you are sure there is what? No hook beneath. Can you imagine all the problems we'd solve in our society today if we would just follow that? Don't bite at the bait of pleasure until you are what? Sure there's no hook beneath. And by the way, there's a lot of things that are helpful that have no hooks. You know, in America, we have this big marijuana issue. Marijuana has a hook, and it can increase psychosis. It can increase all sorts